And with that, we will dive right into it. And we want to turn to the ongoing saga here of the sort of shaping of the media space in the United States as it concerns how people view China and what they think about it. And to continue with this ongoing story, we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Amanda Yee, who is the host of Radio Free Amanda, great podcast, and also an editor at liberationnews.org. Amanda, as always, thanks so much for being back with us.
Hey, Rania. Hey, Eugene. Thanks for having me back.
Well, it's always our pleasure to have you on, Amanda. And I mean, this is, I every week, every day, I should say, one of the first things that I do, and this is not an advertisement for the New York Times, but just to keep up with the paper that's really setting the agenda in so many ways for what the mainstream media is covering. One of the first things I do is look at the headlines of the New York Times. And over the last several weeks, I've noticed a trend that increasingly the top stories, sometimes even more than one on a given day, are just these like anti-China propaganda stories. It's like a tsunami of them over the last month. And I just want to read a few of the headlines and get your reaction to that. Just from a few days ago, you had, well, first of all, you've got, okay, I'm just going to read a bunch of headlines when you look up China on the New York Times. Why is China in so much trouble when ideology gets in the way of the obvious solutions? How Xi Jinping returned China to one-man rule. China's exports fall for fourth straight month. China's military is going global. China's economic pain is a test of Xi Jinping's fixation with control. China to its people. Spies are everywhere. Help us catch them. And I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. I mean, you really get the sense, especially with this latest one, China to its people, spies are everywhere, help us catch them. You really get the sense that the New York Times really wants us to hate China. But like, what's going on here? Why are we more recently getting flooded with this like insane tsunami of anti-China content at the New York Times? Has China just become like more evil? What's happening?
Okay, so I want to return to that Spies Are Everywhere headline in a few minutes because that one's particularly egregious. But first, I just want to just to say in general, what this signals is that we're in a new Cold War and we are in a major power conflict with China. Like the US is headed toward major power conflict with China. And if the headlines, the media coverage, it really parallels how the Soviet Union was covered during that period in the previous Cold War, right? New York Times coverage of China, it really reminds me of what Michael Parenti said in his book, Black Shirts and Reds, about US propaganda against the Soviet Union during the previous Cold War. He said that Western media coverage could transform any data about existing communist societies, transform it into hostile evidence against that society. So if the Soviets refused to negotiate, they were belligerent. If churches in the Soviet Union were empty, then religion was being suppressed. If the churches were full, that meant that people were rejecting the atheism of the ruling regime. If workers went on strike, it was an expression of their alienation from the collectivist system. If they didn't go on strike, then that was because they lacked freedom and they were scared of government repression. So it's really similar to how US corporate media has been covering China for the past few years. If they find one person who's critical of the CPC, then that person becomes representative of the entire 1.4 billion population of Chinese people, even though, a Harvard study found that 90% of Chinese people were satisfied with their government. But then this study becomes evidence that Chinese people are lying because they're afraid to criticize the CPC in public. The successful containment of COVID, its successful dynamic zero COVID strategy somehow gets repackaged as a human rights violation. De-radicalization of religious extremists and the prevention of terrorist activities through economic development of Xinjiang, that's suddenly framed as a genocide. And then when they can't find any evidence of a genocide occurring, then it becomes repackaged as cultural genocide. And then we see a lot of, the anti-corruption campaigns and reining in of capital, like efforts we would love to see in the US, is framed as she ruling with an iron fist. I think what this really signals is that, the US is preparing itself and the public for a major power conflict with China. So there's that angle of it. But also, the New York Times just has a really long history of red baiting and McCarthyism in general. This is part of a much longer history of them engaging in this kind of red baiting. They have always been very reliable purveyors of Red Scare hysteria against anyone who challenged US foreign policy. In 2016, they published a story about Green Party candidate Jill Stein, in which they baselessly smeared her as a Russian asset, whose entire presidential campaign was promoted by Russian operatives. The New York Times has been a reliable actor in the previous Red Scare of the 1950s. During this period, they'd published articles fear-mongering over communists among public school teachers and union organizers. But it was really the leaders of the Black liberation struggle that were the most viciously attacked, right? For instance, the New York Times in 1949 described Paul Robeson as a Black Stalin with delusions of grandeur. And also during the case of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were accused of sharing nuclear secrets with the Soviet Union, the New York Times demonized the pair all the way up to their execution. And when the execution came, the newspaper ran an entire column on the front page running a play-by-play of their execution. So this is just part and parcel of what the New York Times does in the service of U.S. imperialism.
No, excuse me. I think that's an extraordinarily important point. And I think, honing in especially on the point you were making about the preparations for, a real confrontation with China, or not the preparations, the first stages of a real confrontation with China that we're seeing, I think is especially important vis-a-vis the one article that Rania mentioned that I thought was new, it was just mind-blowing to me about, whatever the headline was, China telling its people that spies are everywhere. And the thing I just couldn't get out of my head was that map that I think several people have done in several different ways of the huge number of American military bases surrounding China. And obviously, of course, the fact that China has no military bases surrounding the United States or really anywhere except one place in the world. And it just felt almost like it was like a mirror image of what America is doing, but then sort of projected onto China. So anyway, before I editorialize, talk about that if you could, because I thought it caught a number of people's eye.
Yeah, so that headline, China to its people, spies are everywhere, help us catch them. As we like to say, when the US government or corporate media talks about China, every accusation is a confession, right? This article was particularly egregious and really audacious on the part of the New York Times, considering that just a few weeks ago, they published a baseless story smearing organizations like No Cold War and Code Pink, organizations that have been very vocal against this escalating aggression against China. They smeared them as foreign agents in service of the Chinese government. And just days after this New York Times article was published, the Wall Street Journal ran ran another story. And the first sentence of this article, it said, Chinese nationals, sometimes posing as tourists, have accessed military bases and other sensitive sites in the US as many as 100 times in recent years. According to US officials who described the incidents as a potential espionage threat. So just within the past year, we've seen this mass hysteria by these same corporate media outlets around a so-called Chinese spy balloon, which according to US officials, months after it was shot down, it didn't actually collect any intelligence. We've seen stories about a so-called Chinese military base in Cuba, which actually doesn't exist. We've seen stories of secret Chinese police stations operating in New York City, Chinatown, and across the world, which are neither secret nor police stations. Now they're fear-mongering over Chinese nationals posing as tourists. And in 2020, we saw Trump issue an executive order which canceled the visas of thousands of Chinese nationals, of Chinese grad students studying in the US. And Biden has continued that policy through the regular denial of visas to Chinese researchers. And then under the China Initiative, we saw the Department of Justice ruthlessly target Chinese academics and researchers in the US as foreign agents for, as little as, failing to account for a foreign affiliation on a grant form. So they were targeted as foreign agents because they filled out a grant form wrong. And then more recently, we've seen the state go after activists who've been speaking out against this new Cold War. So, given all this, I think we really have to ask ourselves, who is the one that's really paranoid about foreign enemies? At the same time, I think it's also really important to point out that insofar as there really exists a fear or nervousness or what the New York Times calls, paranoia on the part of China over US spies, how can you say that it's not justified? The US is the one that has a long history of overthrowing governments it doesn't like. It's the one that deploys CIA operations across the globe to repress left-wing or nationalist governments that try to assert any kind of national sovereignty. It's the one that makes up excuses to invade countries only to turn them into resource colonies. It's not China doing that, it's the US. And so, of course, it does it through military means, but also through much more insidious ways, like through the funding of USAID projects, National Endowment for Democracy programs, and the creation of local NGOs. And these are all tools that the US empire uses to try and reshape civil society in a way that makes it more conducive or accepting of US intervention under the guise of democracy. So this has happened, and this is still happening in countless areas of the world that resist US hegemony, even in the slightest way. And right now, the US is rapidly moving toward a full military confrontation with China. It's corralling all of its resources in preparation for a military, like a war. It's the empire's number one enemy. So if China is nervous about spies, it's not without reason or historical precedent.
Those are all excellent points. It's pure projection. And it's also, I'm curious, Amanda, if you could talk a bit about the media's role here. I mean, I know that's essentially what we're having a conversation about because this started out as a conversation about the New York Times. But when you look at the way the New York Times or CNN or the Washington Post covers this, I mean, you hear so much from the US about state media in Russia, state media in China. But yes, these are corporate media outlets, but they might as well just be regime outlets, the way that they cover this stuff. But can you talk a bit about the importance of the media's framing here and really, I guess the word would be priming the American public for some sort of looming war?
Yeah, yeah. The US, as we've pointed out a few times, it is preparing for major power conflict with China. It's using every tool at its disposal. Just as it did to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the US is applying the same policy of containment against China, which involves military pressure and encirclement, subjecting it to bans and boycotts, cutting it off from key technologies to thwart its economic development, while also fueling these like particular contradictions within China, which the US hopes will lead to balkanization. And this is where the role of the media comes in. This is why over the past few years, we've seen corporate media constantly push these news stories about the Hong Kong protests, about supposed genocide in Xinjiang, about Taiwan independence. It's not because the US government or the media cares about them. It's because they're trying to use these issues as pressure points in the hopes of splitting up China into a bunch of different ethno-states that are easier for US imperialism to penetrate and manage. So the idea behind this containment strategy, then as now, is that they hope that this is constant external pressure applied by the US would then heighten these internal contradictions that are going on, magnify these internal problems such that they'll boil over and China will collapse from within. And, that is the role of the media. It manufactures consent for this upcoming war. And war with China pretty much enjoys bipartisan support among those in Washington, right? I mean, we're witnessing right now a whole political realignment happening within the Republican Party. Among the Trump wing of the party, people like Josh Hawley and Marjorie Taylor Greene, where their entire political program pretty much is trying to end US involvement in Ukraine in order to direct those resources toward a war with China. And the reason for this is because China is rising. It's managed to contain COVID with its zero COVID policy. Its life expectancy has now surpassed that of the US. It's implemented a poverty alleviation program that was really successful and eliminated extreme poverty. It's developing its Belt and Road Initiative, which will eventually shift the economic center of gravity toward China through better connecting it to like the emerging economies of Africa and other parts of Asia, right? And really, China, along with BRICS, which it's a part of, represents something significant, especially to those in the global south. And it represents the beginnings of a shift away from this US-led unipolarity, away from this world order that it created after World War II, where the US kind of united all the former imperialist powers under Washington's leadership and made it so that every institution was created to ensure US dominance and advancement of US interests. So, we had the UN on the diplomatic front, NATO on the military front, on the economic front, we have the IMF and the World Bank and the establishment of the US dollar as the global reserve currency. And so China represents like a shift away from that US-led unipolarity. And that's why the US is so threatened by it, because China signals the possibility of something different. And that's why we're accelerating toward this major power conflict. And that's why the US media is, increasingly ramping up its anti-China demonization.
Mm-hmm. Well, as always, Amanda, we are very, very honored that you were willing to come on and help us sort through all of this. You are, of course, an editor with liberationnews.org, where people can check out your writing on this topic and many other great things, and also the host of Radio Free Amanda, which hopefully is also a podcast everyone is following. But thanks for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.